I've been asked to talk about the Kusarigama, but honestly, I was hesitant to dive into this mix of a sickle and a chain. The thing is, while there's plenty written about Japanese weapons, a lot of it is contradictory or outright questionable. And the Kusarigama? It's the pinnacle of these contradictions. Some sources paint it as an incredibly effective weapon. Others claim there's no evidence of it ever being used in real combat. Stories about a farmer caught in a field by samurai who used the Kusarigama's chain and sickle to defend himself are followed by conclusions that farmers had nothing to do with creating or using this thing. By the way, while the name combines the words kusari, chain, and kama, sickle, Japanese can be tricky. It's pronounced gama, not kama. Researcher Nawayamio even suggests it was just a stable hands tool. The sickle was used to cut ropes, like freeing tied-up horses during a fire, while the chain was for warding off horse thieves. Some see the Kusarigama as a kind of training tool for warriors to improve coordination, or as a flashy performance weapon. Others argue the sickle was just a tool for clearing dense vegetation, something like a machete. There are also claims that the sickle was widely used at sea, as a kind of grappling hook for pulling enemy boats closer during boarding, or for cutting through seaweed that could snag ships in shallow waters. The Kusarigama first appears in some sources as early as the 12th century, while others place it in the 14th to 16th centuries. It's worth noting that this weapon, like many we consider Japanese, isn't entirely Japanese in origin. It comes from Okinawa, which didn't become a part of Japan until the 17th century. Its origins likely date to the 14th or 15th centuries, when a ban on weapons was imposed on locals after a civil war. There's plenty of debate about its design, especially the chain's length, which ranges from 2 to 3.5 or even 6 meters, depending on the source. At least the sickle part is more consistent. Its handle is usually around 60 centimeters, and the blade about 20. Even here, though, there are distinctions between curved farming tools and straighter versions designed for combat. To avoid adding to the myths, I won't dive too deeply into its history here. Instead, I'll share my subjective take on how it might have been used and what its advantages were. Flexible weapons with a long, movable section and a striking weight existed across many cultures. Perhaps the best-known example is the flail, which became widespread in Europe, likely introduced by Turkic peoples in the 8th century, before spreading to Rus, and then Western Europe during the High Middle Ages. A weight on a cord or chain had several advantages. It was compact, easy to conceal, and a weight under 100 grams was enough to cause serious injuries. Deflecting a flail's strike was tough, even with a shield, because the flexible section could curve around the shield's edge and still land a hit. Flails were popular among bandits and served as self-defense weapons for peasants and craftsmen, cheap and effective. Often, flails were used without a wooden handle, consisting simply of a metal or bone weight attached to a cord. Two-handed flails, which evolved from agricultural tools, became popular later in the Middle Ages. They combined significant destructive power with the ability to strike from a distance. During the Hussite Wars, these peasant weapons proved effective against European knights, who eventually started using them as well. There were also more specialized weapons, consisting of a weight on a long, flexible section without a handle. In Europe, such weapons were sometimes also called flails, adding to the confusion. In Japan, they were known as kusari or Kusari-fundo, and China had a similar weapon called the flying hammer or meteor hammer. I had the chance to see how this type of weapon works, with a long rope several meters in length, during a reenactment gathering back in 2006. A weight on a long cord is incredibly hard to block, but these fights are usually over in seconds. Either the wielder lands a strong hit and disables their opponent, or they miss and lose. The bouts I watched were between a relatively skilled swordsman armed with a longsword and a less experienced flail wielder who'd only trained for a few weeks. Despite this, the flail wielder often came out on top. Blocking the strike of a weight on a long cord is very difficult, and the flail's user has a clear advantage in striking range. But sometimes, there were mishaps. The rope would tangle around a sword, but disarming the swordsman wasn't so easy. A sword, even wrapped in rope or chain, is still far more dangerous than just a chain in hand. Similar situations probably occurred in Japan, or more precisely Okinawa. This might partly explain the creation of the Kusarigama. Combining a sickle with a chain solved several issues at once. The first, less obvious one, was portability. A flexible part like a rope or chain could easily tangle or make noise if carried loose. but wrapping it around the sickle's shaft made the weapon compact and quiet. If the chain missed its target or tangled an enemy's weapon or limb, the sickle could then be brought into play. That said, let's clarify a few points. First, while Kusarigama jutsu involves many intricate techniques, and videos show sickles deflecting sword strikes with ease, real combat likely wasn't as elegant. The sickle in this combo was more for finishing off a tangled, wounded, or disarmed opponent, or as a last-ditch option if the chain strike failed. Fighting a swordsman with just a sickle would have been very challenging. Second, it's worth noting that this isn't a single weapon but two separate ones. At any given moment, you're either using the sickle or the chain. Their combination was more about portability and readiness. Some versions attached the chain directly to the sickle blade rather than the handle base, allowing for one-handed use. This made it resemble a flail with a sickle attached to the end. Keep in mind, this weapon wasn't meant for open battlefields, nor was it practical in tight alleys or dense foliage. The Kusarigama worked best for surprise attacks, ideally from behind. The flexible chain, several meters long, allowed for strikes from a distance without closing in. Such an attack was hard to block, and honestly, the chain could take down a more skilled and physically stronger opponent. I've come across claims that samurai viewed the Kusarigama as dishonorable, though I can't say how true that is. When used, the goal of the first strike was to injure the opponent, tangle a limb, or restrict their movement, perhaps even disarm them or knock them down. Though in real combat, pulling this off was no easy feat. Alternatively, it could at least confuse or shock the opponent. For added effect, people sometimes used a burning weight, tied snakes to the chain, or in later periods, attached something like primitive firecrackers. Fighting someone armed with a Kusarigama could feel like this. First, you're blindsided by a thrown brick, then they charge at you with a knife. If the enemy was unarmed and the space tight, the sickle or chain could be used immediately for choking. A wounded opponent could also be tied up with the chain or rope. There are even mentions of using the sickle itself as the weighted part of the chain, but the practicality of that seems questionable. Articles often emphasize how mastering the chain requires countless hours of training, but I think that's a bit exaggerated. Sure, the East has developed countless martial arts with intricate techniques, but real combat tends to be less flashy and more straightforward. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and in most cases, strikes with melee weapons should be quick and direct. No one is going to spin a chain in elaborate arcs when a simple swing can deliver a blow to the back of the head. At first glance, the Kusarigama seems like a versatile weapon, capable of slicing and stabbing up close while delivering crushing blows from a distance of a few meters. Beyond inflicting damage, it could disorient, immobilize, or disarm an opponent. But in reality, it's a very niche tool designed for quick, offensive actions. Its essence lies in launching an almost projectile-like strike, using the range and difficulty of blocking the weight to gain the upper hand against a more skilled foe. However, if the wielder failed to capitalize on this advantage and the opponent closed the distance, the fight came down to the sickle. Compared to a katana or tachi, the sickle isn't exactly an intimidating weapon. Most of the flashy techniques seen in videos demonstrating the Kusarigama's potential can only work in ideal training conditions, not in a real fight.